Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, April 12th, 2024. Hope you're having a great day. Hi, everybody out there, except OJ Simpson, I guess, who's now well, don't tell him I said this. You can't. All right. That was big news yesterday. I don't know how to treat that on this show. He's not a political player. He did die. It's a big deal. Everyone's talking about it. I don't know. I guess I get to feel rather neutral about it. I don't know. What do you say about something like that? I guess there were some news organizations that were forced to acknowledge him, maybe his hometown newspaper, etc., that kind of had to acknowledge him as a fallen hero. But I don't know. All right. Well, at any rate, luckily we don't have to spend any time on it. He's dead. Now you know. If that's the news you came for, well, show's over. Have a good weekend. Take off early for the day and enjoy yourself. If not, then all right. We have 2 hours to try to satisfy your curiosity about everything else. Okay. We'll see how everything falls into place today. It's Friday. It's a good day to clean out what's been in pocket for the week. There will be more news generated, etc., of course, but we do have to get everybody all caught up for the weekend and prepared for Monday. Monday, kind of a big deal here. Let's see. All right, a little note here, technical note from Justice. Okay. Well, we're having continuing, I guess, technical difficulties on his end, but it seems like we're up and streaming, but it will, watch this, block the ability to produce a new West Coast cookbook and speakeasy, which follows our program. So what do I say in the last minute of the show? Well, look, the reality of it is I'm usually reading you the end of an article, and then I say, oh, yeah, by the way, Justice is coming by. Have a good weekend. So this gives me an extra 30 seconds or so to read something or read some part of something that was impossibly long and I never should have begun in the first place. A usual Friday tradition. Okay, let's see what's hanging out in both in pocket and in email, the various updates, the 7,000 emails that I get from The Hill, which usually reminds me, alongside the New York Times, of various stories that require some attention. And we probably do need to do some catching up on what happened this week in Congress, even though, essentially the answer is nothing. I do want to at least acknowledge the fact that, as expected, the so-called Freedom Caucus, the most MAGA lunatics of all the MAGA lunatics in the loony House of Representatives, did buck leadership once again and decide to sink the FISA reauthorization bill, about which I also have mixed feelings, a little bit like OJ Simpson. Because, of course, FISA, of course, has been horribly abused in the past, but you have to say that with a grain of salt, I guess, or at least some dose of caution anyway, because you will find yourself, if by let's say untrained observers, confused perhaps with the MAGA position, which is that FISA has been horribly abused against them or in use against them. And therefore, it is a terrible thing to do, a terrible thing to reauthorize it. There's no upside to it. There's no legitimate use of it. It was once used, in the popular imagination anyway, against Donald Trump himself. They used the FISA to record all the telephone conversations from Trump Tower. And, of course, the implication is that they were spying on his campaign, as opposed to the fact that, well, Trump Tower was full of criminals operating internationally with foreign intelligence targets as their partners in crime. And that's why so much was being monitored in and out of Trump Tower. It was the international crime scene that they were worried about, as opposed to the domestic crime scene that was the Trump campaign. Anyway, they, of course, have taken personal offense, and once Donald Trump finds out that there's a law that can be used against him, that law has to go. So anyway, they not only sunk the bill, procedurally, it's important to note that they sunk the rule for the bill. So there was a big to-do among, I guess, you could say among the procedural crowd. And, well, that still leaves the bill unauthorized and I guess looking at expiration come Monday. But by Monday, you'll probably be paying attention to something completely different, which is, of course, the start of Trump's first criminal trial. Now, I kept some of these things in email prominently displayed so that I would remember to bring this up with you. But on Monday, you should not expect to see Donald Trump clapped in irons and dragged into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit. All of his suits are orange somewhere, usually around the neckline, but not the full body thing. This is not what's going on. And reminder, the trial encompasses a lot of different procedural stages. And in this case, on Monday, what they mean by this is the beginning of jury selection, which could drag on for some time. You know, there'll be theatrics from the Trump side, and there'll be careful procedure, I'm sure, as well. We'll call it it's careful procedure on the side we like and bumbling idiocy on the side we don't like. Let's just confirm those priors right now. But yes, you can expect that there might be some very contentious grilling of potential jurors. The Trump side will likely want to exclude just about anybody who doesn't show up to court in a MAGA hat. But of course, if you show up to court in a MAGA hat, you'll be excluded by the prosecution. So, I don't know. A little advice if you think you're going to sneak onto the jury that way. Although, quite honestly, in a Manhattan jury, you'll probably stick out like a sore thumb and be picked up within seconds. Anyway, the point is that it won't be any sort of Perry Mason moment. There won't be any Donald Trump on the stand grilled by Alvin Bragg and cornered into admitting that he's been a lifelong criminal. Not Monday, anyway, and probably not ever. So I have this guide from the New York Times, and it is their Times that we're talking about. Of course, that's where the trial is going to be. It's the hometown paper, so to speak, of the Trump trial. What to know about the trial Donald Trump faces in Manhattan. And so all the things that you have known so far are the wrong things to know. And now you'll find out what the right things are from the New York Times. Thank God. Prosecutors accused Donald Trump of falsifying business records to cover up a sex scandal. That you should already know about the trial that he faces in Manhattan, I'll admit that. But it will be the first criminal trial of a former president. Well, so far, good for you. You're 2 for 2. You knew both of those things. But we haven't gotten to the body of the article yet. Ben Protas, who has covered most of these things, and you know them, well, frankly, because he and a few others at the New York Times have reported them dutifully. Might as well give credit where it's due here. Also on the byline here, Kate Christobeck and Jonah E. Bromwich. Not to be confused with Jonah F. Bromwich. Or Jonah F. Sandwich, for that matter, I guess. I don't know. I love when they include the middle initial. It's very formal, and I like to oblige them. In just 1 week, although this is now only a few days, this was an April 8th article, and I assume they still expect this from the Donald Trump trial. This is where actually I was pointed to when I opened up their email that was titled, Trump on Trial, Finally a Trial. And it, this actually was offering me Jesse McKinley's coverage. And it's interesting that I went to put it in Pocket and I clicked on it so I could drop it in Pocket, and it brought me to actually this other article that I just started reading. And maybe now I was thinking maybe I'll switch back to the email. The thing with it is, in Pocket, you get the visual reminder of what's in store when it obliges and provides a picture and gives you the headline. But in email, it's just sort of drifting out there, one of many. No guarantee that I'll get back to it and find it again. But both of these pieces started by pointing out that on Monday, it's just, it's just jury selection. So I kind of wanted to make sure everybody cooled their jets a little bit on that. It's exciting to see it finally starting, and I don't imagine there's much chance that the Trump trial team is going to stumble upon anything that will convince anybody on the Court of Appeals to issue any sort of last-minute stay. I think they were out of ideas a long time ago. Don't look for any of that to change. So let's see. Maybe I'll use the more up-to-date of the two pieces. The April 11th piece, Trump on Trial, from Jesse McKinley, rather than the earlier written What to Know, because we already know what we need to know. Finally, this one begins, A Case Goes to Trial. That's a better headline, I think. Welcome back to Trump on Trial. I guess that's a vertical that the Times is running special for the event. I'll be filling in, says Jesse McKinley, for Maggie Haberman and Alan Feuer today. How do you like that? I didn't realize they were off yesterday. Starting on Monday, I'll be part of the Times team of reporters covering the first criminal trial of a former American president. It will unfold in a dingy courthouse just blocks from New York's City Hall, and we'll be there for every twist and turn. So I think it's nice that it's dingy. It's good setting. It should be a doozy, complete with hush money. And I have seen some of the frameologists out there. I forget who was responsible for this one, and somebody was pointing out, not going to work. Don't call it a hush money trial. Call it a something else. And I think it was a voter deception trial. But I don't know if that's going to catch on anytime soon. Certainly everybody understands hush money. And I think everybody understands why that's bad. But the trial will lay it out for you. But at any rate, it should be a doozy complete with hush money, a porn star, and a fuming defendant, and a defendant's fumes, as far as I know. But still not really getting a lot of press confirmation about it. Makes me wonder whether or not he really does, in fact, stink as horribly as has been reported. But we'll wait and see. Yes, it could test the resilience of our legal institutions and the concept that no individual is above the law. All true. And the stink thing, I don't know, maybe not. By the way, I understand he made a stop in an Atlanta area Chick-fil-A restaurant the other day to buy 30 milkshakes. Now, granted, this is allegedly not for himself. Although you never know. Everything he says is a lie, and his big announcement was he was going to be giving out milkshakes to everybody, not everybody, at the store. But he did helpfully note with a little grain of, a little kernel of truth in there, and we'll probably be keeping some for ourselves, too. Some people on his crew want some milkshakes. So he went in and glad-handed everybody. And the staff was well-trained. They behaved about the way you would think they would behave for any actual normal presidential candidate who came in to visit. They smiled and said hello, and they laughed when the guy was making a joke. They probably laughed at a few foreign policy proposals that they didn't realize were jokes. And nobody commented at all, what's that horrible smell? So I don't know. It makes me wonder. Certainly the press isn't doing it. But I mean, if you're sitting in a Chick-fil-A eating, there were people just minding their own damn business, eating, and then the whole place gets swarmed by security and campaign aides, et cetera, but nobody's eating their meal and then saying, what is that awful smell? Why do I have to smell that while I'm eating? So sometimes I wonder how consistent that actually is. All right, now back to his being on trial. Donald Trump's trial is the culmination of a case that has been hotly contested since it was unveiled last spring after months of legal machinations, including three long-shot appeal attempts this week. It seems to be on track to actually begin. Jury selection is scheduled to start on Monday. Testimony is expected to last weeks amid a level of media scrutiny that some have likened to the OJ Simpson trial nearly 3 decades ago, which is amazing because I think he wrote and published that before finding out that OJ Simpson had just died. It's going to be a reference point for media circuses centered around a trial, whether he's dead or not. But okay. Big mystery. We'll have to find that out. There's no time stamp on this one. Although I could, now I'm curious. I'll look at the date or the time on the email. 3:16 p.m. Did we know that OJ Simpson was dead by that point? And that's the email. So this probably went to, well, they don't go to press anymore, but whatever. Yeah, maybe before they found out. I wonder whether Jesse was roaming the halls saying, quick, rewrite, put something in there about OJ being actually dead. Anyway, this is no murder trial, but it still has sensational elements. Trump faces 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to try to hide a sexual encounter he is alleged to have had with Stormy Daniels, a porn star he met in 2006. The former president denies the charges and having had sex with her. And she will acknowledge that he barely did do that, so it's maybe not worth discussing that part of it. Prosecutors could call Daniels and a former Playboy model, Karen McDougal, who said she had an affair with Trump, as well as Michael Cohen, who, kind of had an affair with Trump. He is, of course, Trump's former fixer, who made the payment to Daniels just before the 2016 election. These witnesses and testimony are likely to produce days of popcorn-worthy coverage, though, as with many trials dealing with financial matters, there may be a few sleepy sessions, too. And I guess I would remind you that the heart of this trial and the legal theory upon which Bragg really rests the whole thing is that they falsified the FEC reports with respect to this hush money payment. One, it was hush money, and I don't know whether that's specifically illegal, but then the next theory is, well, it was meant to withhold critical information from the public in making their selection of presidents. And, that's supposed to be important. And I don't know whether it ever rises to criminal, but I guess this will test some of that theory. But also, of course, you can't falsify the purposes of these payments on your FEC reports because reasons. Not that the FEC can actually enforce anything against you because it's constantly deadlocked because it's a evenly divided body and now by design can do nothing. But, these are reports that there's supposed to be some consequences for falsifying them. And if they can prove that that's the case, well, if the FEC won't enforce them with a fine, perhaps they can be enforced by the courts with criminal penalties. Anyway, what to expect? Well, you can have greater expectations than this, but this is what Jesse McKinley says. Here's how the trial is likely to unfold. Day one, just in case you were wondering, and maybe we just do the first couple of days so that you're prepared for Monday. Day one, several hundred jurors are expected to be called in on Monday to potentially serve a critical vetting period known as voir dire. Both prosecution and defense teams will be trying to sniff out hidden biases with the help of a detailed juror questionnaire. It could be a grueling multi-day or even multi-week process. That's absolutely true. And very likely it's just, it's not going to make for compelling television. You won't be able to turn on the TV on Monday and see, trial action being covered. It will be just too boring for television. No one and in all likelihood, they will not be. I don't think they would even allow cameras in the courtroom for jury voir dire. They want to keep that a little bit more hushed. Trump, who claims to be displeased by a trial that he feels is profoundly unfair, could be in court 4 days a week. Wednesdays are off days, so write that down on your schedule. The judge, Justice Juan Merchan, has issued a gag order barring the former president from attacking prosecutors, witnesses, court staff, and the judge's own family members after a series of angry posts on Trump's Truth Social account and elsewhere. The trial won't be televised, so if you turn on your television hoping to see the trial, enjoy perhaps a feature film instead, and just keep watch at the newspapers. Or really, you could probably get more information from social media, reporters covering the event and then dashing out of the courtroom. I don't know if they're going to allow them to text, tweet, or what have you inside the courtroom. They very frequently ban that, and they just come out and give occasional updates. The trial won't be televised, but reporters will be able to post updates directly from the courtroom. There's the answer. And a nearby overflow room. Expect a lot of focus on Trump's demeanor and the interaction between his legal team and Merchan, who has kept the defense on a short leash so far. And I would imagine, though it won't be televised, the reporters watching for reactions at the defense table should be able to tell whether any members of the defense team are battling to overcome the stench rising from the defendant, and whether or not the jury are able to detect this. But it won't start Monday. That's the important part. All 34 counts are Class E felonies, the lowest category of felonies, unlike the old Disney ride tickets. And let's see. That's Trump's lawyers will be hoping for an acquittal, of course. Thank you very much for letting me know about that. I didn't know that about defense attorneys in trials. Or for a holdout juror, which could lead to a mistrial. If the former president is found guilty, each count carries a maximum prison sentence of 4 years. And a lot of experts, by the way, expecting no more than supervised release or probation of some kind, even upon conviction. But we'll see. The Manhattan proceeding may be Trump's only trial before the election. 2 federal cases, as well as another state case in Georgia, could all be pushed back, as you know, until after the voters decide whether to once again elect Trump or re-elect President Biden in November, if the election, of course, matters at all. It may be the case that it simply does not, and Trump takes control with or without the results of the election. Okay, well, interesting. I don't know how I'm going to link to this thing, because every time I click on what the email offers, it brings me to the other story that I was going to read you, which is why that's how I ended up beginning on it. All right, well, we'll see whether I can figure that out. I'm sure I can track it down and just search. Oh, you know what? That's something we could do, Gil. Can you find a copy of this article that I was just reading on the web, and directly, and get me a link for that? That's Jesse McKinley's piece in the New York Times entitled "Finally, a Case Goes to Trial." There you go. A good usage of extra production staff on hand today. All right, let's see. Other things that I wanted to bring to you. Let's see. What happened to my pocket display? All right, well, it was overwhelmed by my search, my clicking on everything to try to find the article I wanted from email. That's one of the troubles that email produces. Okay, let's see. Scrolling back down a little bit, there's a couple of new things on the pile that I picked up along the way today. Oh, yes, I should also note for the record, we covered this as breaking news the other day when it happened while Greg was on the air, but there is, of course, coverage available of Weisselberg, Alan Weisselberg, being finally sentenced to jail. This covered by the Washington Post's Shana Jacobs, ex-Trump company executive Weisselberg sentenced to 5 months in jail. I don't know how extensively we ought to read all the way through this, but it is of some interest. Certainly the headline needed to be announced, although that we did that the day it broke. Longtime executive at Donald Trump's company sentenced to 5 months in jail on Wednesday after pleading guilty to lying under oath in the New York Attorney General's civil investigation into business practices at the Trump Organization and at the trial that resulted from it. So at least we have that going on. Any more that we can distill from this thing? One, of course, he's expected to serve his sentence at Rikers Island, which is not a great place to be, ever. Unclear whether Weisselberg will be called as a witness in Trump's criminal trial that was scheduled to begin, of course, Monday. And his plea agreement does not require him to cooperate with the Manhattan District Attorney in that case. So I guess it's an open question. Weisselberg's lawyer, Seth L. Rosenberg, said in a statement on Wednesday, Alan Weisselberg accepted responsibility for his conduct and now looks forward to the end of this life-altering experience and to returning to his family and his retirement. Okay. Weisselberg, 76, now a Florida resident, pleaded guilty on March 4th to several counts of perjury for lying in sworn testimony, both before and during the Trump Organization civil fraud trial in the case brought last year by New York Attorney General Letitia James. He's been embroiled in Trump's legal issues for years because he was a key figure at the former president's namesake company for decades. This is pretty much, I think, background that we were more or less aware of. Let's see. Yeah, I don't think anything new pointed out in this thing, but just acknowledging, yes, it's a 5-month sentence. I guess it starts soon. He's been sentenced, but yeah, is there any information in here about, like, well, when do they expect to see him? And will he be turning himself in? And did he already do that? This I don't see so far. Okay. Well, here's part of the answer, I guess. Trump, I'm sorry. This is Trump appealing the judge's decision. This is about his, various fines. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to look that up. Maybe that's something else to research. Can we find any information about, that tells us when we should expect to see Alan Weisselberg report for the beginning of his jail term? I think they're giving up. And, as I said, looking forward to the end of it, which means, of course, without saying so, they're looking forward to the beginning of it so that, they can get in, get out. But it's interesting just to see a Trump person not fighting tooth and nail to avoid reporting the way Peter Navarro did. Navarro, of course, is in jail now, and I understand that at some point during the week filed a motion for some kind of early release. He's been there a matter of days. He's got months to go. We'll see how he does.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see, where to go next? Well, there's lots awaiting in Pocket, and more things as I go along that I feel like I should add to Pocket. But we can't get to it all. Something I mentioned yesterday and then didn't get to stories about, which kind of puts it at the top of the list for coverage today, mentioned in passing that both Alabama and Ohio, where the secretaries of state are currently Republican, and really have been for quite some time, are threatening, perhaps in direct retaliation for the so far failed threat to use the 14th Amendment's Section 3 to exclude Donald Trump from the ballot, are now threatening to use obscure procedural rules, but obscure or not, if they're there, on the books in those states that purport, at any rate, to give them the power to exclude Joe Biden from the ballot in those states, Ohio and Alabama. Less than competitive states for Biden, probably, but as a matter of principle, of course, you want to make sure you're on the ballot everywhere and are competing, and of course that people can come out and express their wishes at any rate, even if they're overwhelmed by voters from the other side. Though many have pointed out that if everybody who was eligible, was registered and participated and was able to participate and wasn't intimidated out of participating or prohibited by other laws enacted with the specific intent of excluding them, Alabama might be more competitive than you thought. Anyway, what's going on with these two states? I think Ohio was the first to threaten this, and so we will read their piece first. I have a Washington Post piece here by Maham, I don't know, M-A-H-A-M, Maham Javaid, and Kyle Melnick. And again, as always, apologies if we haven't got the name pronunciation right. It's a print medium. We're turning into an audio medium. Ohio warns Democrats that Biden may miss deadline for November ballot. I think they were the first to come out with the threat. Alabama's, at least came to my attention second, but I thought Alabama's warning was more straightforward and easier to understand. So, all right, while we're still awake, perhaps we'll try Ohio, digesting Ohio's problem. Democrats may miss a deadline to get President Biden on the general election ballot in Ohio, according to the state's election management office. In a letter seen by the Washington Post, because it was printed and they have eyes, the Ohio Secretary of State's office told Ohio Democratic Party Chair Liz Walters that the Democratic National Committee's nominating convention is scheduled too late for Biden to make the Ohio ballot because state law requires nominees to be certified at least 90 days before the general election. So that actually does seem regular or relatively straightforward, and now makes Alabama the contender for the more confusing. The Alabama reason is the same, but their deadline is weirder. I think they said 82 days before the general election. 90 days is at least a nice round number. Neither actually makes any sense anymore. I mean, we'll digest this as we go along and read the piece. I don't know whether they address this or not. There was certainly a time, probably about the time that these laws were passed, where you might say, yes, we need 90 days before the election for ballot printing purposes, for any legal verification that has to go on, or any challenges about access to the ballot that might have to be resolved in courts. But, back in the days of the printed ballots, whether they were mailing them to everybody or whether they were handing out sample ballots or whether they were actually printing the ballot cards that were used at the voting places, now, in most places, no longer an issue. And even where they are printed, very rarely do you need 90 days to do it. In fact, here in Virginia, when our ballots are printed, they're I don't know whether it's always for the presidential race the same way. Can't recall, but I think so. But here in Loudoun County, Virginia, when you go for early voting, the ballots are printed on demand, essentially. When you check in, each of the check-in stations has got either its own or access to a laser printer, and you check in, and once they get your name all squared away and are pretty sure you're valid and no Republicans come out of the woodwork to have you arrested, they'll print you a ballot. So they need like 90 seconds, not 90 days. But these laws remain on the books, and there may or may not still be good reasons for them, and we have to deal with that. So the letter, citing Ohio's presidential ballot laws, and how is it that we have such a patchwork of presidential ballot laws? I thought the Supreme Court put an end to that when they considered the 14th Amendment case. Guess not. The letter, citing Ohio's presidential ballot laws, said the deadline to certify a presidential candidate in Ohio is 90 days before the general election. The election is November 5th this year, putting the Ohio deadline at August 7th. But the Democratic National Convention which is expected to nominate Biden, that is the expectation, for a rematch against Donald Trump, isn't scheduled to convene until August 19th. The letter from Paul DeSantis, that's not spelled the same way, but I don't know how else you would pronounce this, Chief Legal Counsel for Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose, who is a Republican, asked Democratic state legislative leaders for clarification to assure the party's timely compliance with Ohio law. Ben Kindle, a spokesperson for LaRose, shared the letter with the Post, but declined to comment further. I know that made it sound very mysterious up top. The letter, which the Post has seen because they showed it to them, was written, and here there's letters and we have eyes. Take a look at this. They did make it sound like they procured it through cloak and dagger, but no, they shared the letter with them. They wanted to be open. They're proud of this. Anyway, members of the Ohio Democratic Party who were copied in the letter, Ohio House Minority Leader Allison Russo and Ohio State Senate Minority Leader Nikki Antonio, did not respond to the Post's request for comment Sunday morning, but Biden campaign said that the president would appear on the ballot. I mean, that's what I would say, but will they? We're monitoring the situation in Ohio, and we're confident that Joe Biden will be on the ballot in all 50 states. Josh Marcus Blank, a Biden-Harris campaign spokesperson, told the Post in an email. The Rose's office suggested that either the Democratic National Committee move up its nominating convention to meet the August 7th deadline, or that the Ohio General Assembly create an exception to the law for the Democrats' nominee. Ohio, by the way, voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. And you might be asking yourself, well, what about the Republican National Convention? When is that being held? And I don't know. Let's see if we can find out myself just on the fly. Yeah, actually, it's relatively early. And it's definitely been later than that in the past. And I don't know what the, motivation was this time, but apparently it begins on July 15th and will have nominated their nominee, Trump, or whoever takes his place if he should drop dead in between now and then, by July 18th. So they've definitely had later conventions than that. But this time around, for some reason, somebody had an eye out, and the Republicans were happening early, the Democrats happening late, and they thought, hey, what a fantastic opportunity to take advantage of. David Niven, a different David Niven, I'm sure, a political science professor, David Niven, at the University of Cincinnati, said he expects the Republican nominee to win Ohio again this fall, even if Biden is on the ballot. Yeah, I would think. But if Biden were omitted, Niven said fewer Democrats would vote, hindering the party's candidates for Senate and House seats. If this were to actually occur and President Biden were held off the ballot, it would be devastating to the general sort of faith in democracy, Niven said. Well, that's a larger point than that turnout would be low, don't you think? This isn't the first time Ohio's law has created scheduling conflicts. In 2020, the Democratic and Republican parties scheduled their conventions for after Ohio's deadline. What? How did that work? And nobody got excluded from the ballot? Knowing this, state lawmakers made a one-time change to reduce the deadline from 90 days before the election to 60, Niven said. And by the way, nothing went wrong as far as I can tell in terms of printing ballots and getting them into the hands they needed to be in for the presidential election, with time reduced by a third. But Niven said that the decision benefited both parties. Of course it did. In Ohio, where the Republican Party controls both legislative chambers and the governor's mansion, Niven said he's unsure whether Republicans will want to implement another exception. If the legislature doesn't make an exception, he said, the Democratic Party may have to name Biden its nominee before the convention or list Biden on the ballot as a third-party candidate. My assumption is that, at least in this moment, democracy will win out, Niven said, but because this is Ohio, it won't be easy. That's an interesting statement, to say the least. And what a fascinating conclusion to come to as a political science professor in 2024, assuming that democracy will win out. Well, that's the job, I guess, because if it doesn't, as a political science professor, you really have to restructure the whole curriculum, and that's going to take a lot of work. Yeah, maybe. It'd be interesting to list him as a third-party candidate, but just to embrace that. Sometimes that occurs to me, right? You get handed a bad hand, and you say, just jump at it, use it, play to it somehow, and even if it's just theatrics, right? Okay, fine. That's the only way we can do it. He's going to be listed as a third-party candidate. Fine, we'll raise the signatures. We can do that. We have that structure in Ohio. What third party, shall we name it? Now, one of the things you might be able to do is to say, well, we're going to name our third party the Democratic Party. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't be able to do that. A real third party that had nothing to do with the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party, that tried to get itself listed as the Democratic Party would be sued by the actual Democratic Party. But if you are the actual Democratic Party and nobody files suit, I don't know. Now, it is Ohio, and there are standing games that could be played anywhere. A Republican could sue. It's likely to cause confusion. Confusion for who? People who want to vote for the real Democratic candidate? Well, this is it. So that would create an interesting situation, and probably just worth pursuing in an alternate universe. But then, of course, there's also the opposite direction, which would be like I'm running as a third-party candidate. My party is called the Trump Reputedly Smells Like Ass Party, and you should check it out. I don't know. You could do that. It would garner a lot of attention. And speaking of driving turnout, I'm going to get a chance to not only vote for Joe Biden, but to, well, I was going to say pull the lever / fill in the oval for the Trump Reputedly Smells Like Ass Party. And it's going to be printed right there on the ballot, and they're going to have to use taxpayer dollars to do it. That's actually kind of exciting. I think it's probably beyond what you could expect the conventional strategists to embrace, but it's worth a shot. I come up with these things from time to time. Conventional strategists want nothing to do with it. Okay, so let's see. A remarkable point from Niven here, my assumption that democracy will win out, but because it's Ohio, it won't be easy. I don't know if he meant those to be read together that way, but it's an interesting point. It would be surprising for a Democratic or Republican nominee not to appear on the general election ballot in all 50 states, but in this year's Democratic primaries, Biden was not on the ballot in New Hampshire. So there you go. Both sides. We all remember how it happened that he wasn't on the ballot in New Hampshire. This was, of course, the New Hampshire party defying the national party on who gets to go first and deciding to hold its own primary anyway, despite the fact that they weren't supposed to. And the actual candidates were then, I guess, instructed by the DNC. Did they say a blanket ban on it? You can't participate, and if you do, you won't be able to participate in the convention, be eligible for nomination. I don't know, but that was the underlying premise for not appearing on the ballot in the primary. Democrats revamped their primary schedule for 2024 to make South Carolina the first contest, of course, but New Hampshire, here's the explanation. Why don't I just keep reading? New Hampshire, where a state law requires that its primaries are the first in the nation, they should just look back at that one, did not push its Democratic primary in response. The national party urged candidates not to participate. Biden opted out and put his name, opted not to put his name on the ballot, but he won as a write-in candidate anyway. That's true, too. Could have run as I guess it's the Democratic Party. But as long as you were able to write anything in, you could have written in Joe, quote, Trump reputedly smells like ass, unquote, Biden, and the vote probably would have counted. In 2016, Trump almost missed appearing on the general election ballot in Minnesota. Did you know that? I didn't remember that. Because of a miscue from that state's Republican Party. In December, Colorado disqualified Trump from the state's primary ballots, but the Supreme Court unanimously overruled that decision. Both major candidates have visited Ohio, which has 17 electoral votes this year. Interesting. They still try to tie it to the electoral votes. I mean, it does have that many electoral votes. That's true. But the idea that, people, remember people who used to try to justify the electoral college system saying, that guarantees that people campaign everywhere. It doesn't, actually. It probably guarantees the opposite. Like, you want to make a trip to Alaska to campaign? No. It's only got 3 electoral votes anyway, and it's extremely far away. So, no, forget about it. I've never really understood that argument for the Electoral College. Anyway, Biden, of course, had visited East Palestine. I think, is that the pronunciation that they use in Ohio? And what a time to be East Palestine. Anyway, that in February, more than a year after the train derailment there that caused environmental issues really, and political disputes. Last month, Trump held a rally in Vandalia, is that right, Ohio, where he said that some immigrants accused of crimes are not people, and that there would be a bloodbath for the country if he's not elected. So, both sides. Both sides have visited Ohio. One used it to check up on recovery from a major disaster, and the other went to threaten widespread murder if he's not elected and level some racist charges against immigrants. So everybody's been there. That's the important part, I guess, somehow. There's another piece along similar lines in Alabama, and let's see, this comes from the AL.com website, which is, again, the consortium for many of the papers in there. But what's the lead paper? I don't recall. So we'll just, all we can do at the moment is say, Alabama.com, and try and, Gil, you want to check that out? What's the major paper down in the leading paper from Alabama that might have run this piece under the title of Alabama Secretary of State Says Democratic Convention Too Late to Get Biden on Ballot This Fall? That's an awfully long headline. So bits and pieces of that, maybe. Mike Cason, Cason, is the writer in this case, but he too simply identified as an AL.com person. Alabama Secretary of State Wes Allen has notified the state and national Democratic parties that a scheduled date for the Democratic National Convention is a few days after the deadline for the party to put its nominee for president and vice president on the ballot for the general election in November. So it sets up the same way. The Republican National Convention came after the same deadline in 2020, that is to say, this problem arose for Trump in 2020. But in Alabama, the legislature passed a bill to allow ballot access, so similar to Ohio. In other words, these deadlines get missed all the time, but in years past, even when the nominee was from another party, people basically said, come on, everybody knows who the nominee is going to be. It would be absurd. We would be the laughingstock of the country if our state excluded one of the major party candidates from the ballot. That's ridiculous. Now, of course, sure, of course, absolutely. Anything we can do to grab any advantage we can. Well, let's see. The Republican National Convention, of course, came after that deadline in 2020, but the legislature passed a bill to allow ballot access. President Joe Biden's campaign released a statement Tuesday in response to Allen's letter saying the deadline would not keep the president off the ballot. On what basis? We don't know. He just says it. Same thing. Joe Biden will be on the ballot in all 50 states. State officials have the ability to grant provisional ballot access certification prior to the conclusion of presidential nominating conventions. In 2020 alone, states like Alabama, Illinois, Montana, and Washington all allowed provisional certification for Democratic and Republican nominees. That's not much to hang your hat on, but they are saying it, and it is true. Allen, who is a Republican, said state law requires parties to provide a certification of nomination for president and vice president no later than August 15th. It has come to my attention recently that the Democratic National Convention is currently scheduled to convene on August 19th, 2024, which is after the state of Alabama's statutory deadline for political parties to provide a certificate of nomination for president and vice president. Allen wrote in a letter to Randy Kelly, chair of the Alabama Democratic Party. If this office has not received a valid certificate of nomination from the Democratic Party following its convention by the statutory deadline, I will be unable to certify the names of the Democratic Party's candidates for president and vice president for ballot preparation for the 2024 election, because, as you know, we write these things by hand. An interesting way of putting it, too, if I don't receive valid certificate of nomination following the convention. So he's kind of hinting that he won't accept as valid certification that precedes the convention, which is interesting, especially since, I don't know, nowadays you can just forge actual electoral college vote certificates, apparently, and at least still walk around free and then run for president again. So why not just forge some valid certificates? They're not valid. I mean, they're forged, but let's litigate it for a while. In the meantime, what can I tell you? Put them on the ballot and we'll find out later whether you were wrong. That's the way it seems to work for Trump. I don't know. Anyway, Allen's office also sent a copy of his letter to Jamie R. Harrison, chair of the Democratic National Committee. The 82-day deadline has been in Alabama's election law since 1975, according to Allen's office. Not 1864, but it'll do. The Democrats are expected to nominate Biden, did you know that, and Vice President Kamala Harris for a rematch with the presumed Republican nominee, Donald Trump. 4 years ago, the Republicans held their convention in late August, the 24th through the 27th, and the legislature passed a bill to make a one-time change in the deadline to accommodate the GOP. Anyway, Alabama's Code Section 17-14-31B says parties must certify their candidates no later than the 82nd day preceding the day fixed for the election. With this year's election on November 5th, that makes August 15th the 82nd preceding day, Allen said in the letter. Allen said the Secretary of State's office has published the certification deadline on its website since June of 2023. I know there were a couple of people saying, don't they have staffers at the DNC and RNC, presumably, who check on the deadlines on each of the dates and say, well, we got to have it done before this date. So whatever date you choose for the convention, it's got to be before these dates. And I'm sure they miss from time to time. And honestly, I mean, they schedule these things so far in advance that it's entirely possible that you could schedule a convention in July for whatever reason, and Republican secretaries of state could find out about that early on and let their legislatures know, and the legislature could say, all right, well, our plan is that in sometime in 2024, early 2024, we'll amend the law to say we need 120 days and use that to exclude the Democratic nominee. That would, would make the papers, but I guess they could try that. But also, I guess, we'll see whether there's legal challenges, and we'll see whether any of the arguments include the fact that there's really no reason to have this kind of deadline on the books. I mean, let's put it this way. Not only do they not need that sort of lead time for printing, but, okay, you say, well, we've just got to have this person's name 82 days. Why 82? I don't know. They decided on it. 82 days before the election, or else we just can't manage it. Well, 82 days before what date? The election day, November 5th. Yeah. Well, how does this figure on early voting? I don't know what the Alabama early voting schedule is like. Guild, we don't need to find out. It's earlier than November 5th. And certainly Ohio, same question. Why don't you need to have these things filed before early voting starts? I guess maybe they figure, well, we got to have it 82 days before the election because, of course, ballots go out well before November 5th. I mean, I guess you could construct it backwards that way. We need 82 days before the election because our ballots for early voting starts, I don't know, let's say 21 days before the election. Why not? So if it's an 82 day deadline, as this is, then what? 72, 62, 61. So that gives you 60 days to prepare all the things that need to be prepared and print the ballots and get them to where they're going so that they can then be drop shipped and then be processed and then sent out. If you're early voting by mail and you want your ballot 21 days ahead of time, and maybe the state says as long as we get your application for that a week in advance, 2 weeks in advance, we can get you your ballot in time for you to be able to mark it and return it. I don't know. Or show up and vote in person early, as many as 14 days in advance. I guess there's real cause for having the ballots obviously need to be prepared well before November 5th, but I don't know about 82 days. But I guess you could end up in court saying, look, the deadline is pretty arbitrary at this point. They no longer need this kind of lead time to print anything anyway. All right, so that's where we stand in Alabama on this one. Let's see. And by the way, Gil tells me that seems all the major newspapers have shuttered as separate entities in Alabama and only survive as part of AL.com, which is kind of astonishing. Like, really? There's no I mean, there's got to be something, I guess, but talk about your news deserts. Well, anyway. And as to Alan Weisselberg, here's what Gil found on that one, by the way. USA Today saying that New York Judge Lori Peterson has said when Weisselberg pleaded guilty that she would sentence him to another 5 months, and on Wednesday began his second stint at Rikers Island Jail Complex. So he's in Rikers now. So at least we have that. Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah. Look, Montgomery, Alabama. He's checking into Montgomery. And I seem to remember that they, I don't know. Montgomery, I don't know. There's the shadow of a remembrance of the Montgomery paper being, does it start with an A? Montgomery? I'm thinking we'll just look it up. Anyway, and it affects none of the content that we were just describing to you. So that's the state of things in Alabama and Ohio. I don't know whether or not there is any real cause for alarm. Most observers are saying, yeah, they'll reach some kind of an accommodation, or that the Democratic National Committee, I guess, could hold some sort of emergency meeting, revamping its procedures, at least for 2024, such that they empower themselves to submit the name of the nominee at some point well in advance of the 82 days. And but they'll say, well, we need to have a convention in order to consider your certificate valid. And they may have to fight about that one, litigate about whether or not the Democratic Party is the one that determines how it will determine its nominee. That really ought to be the case, but it is Alabama, and I guess you'll have to wait and see, because it may be that anything goes. All right, time to wind up our first hour and head off into our 1 minute break. And let's see, what things can we queue up for the second half? Well, we can get a little bit more esoteric, I guess, and talk about some of the weirder things that aren't immediately political, perhaps. But I think something tells me we got a little more political wrap-up to do, maybe some courtroom wrap-up as well. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So yeah, there was that shadow of memory in my head. The Montgomery Advertiser. I doubted myself at the last second because the Hawaii paper, Honolulu, I guess, also has an advertiser, which is an interesting name for a newspaper, by the way. It just sort of tells you where the priority is. What am I buying in the newspaper? News? Well, sort of. It's really about advertising. Okay. At any rate, yeah, from my hotline days, sometimes the names of some of these regional papers stick in my head because it made a difference. We had to know the source of all the things we were gathering for the hotline. And so Montgomery Advertiser, although Gil's review of the paper, you'll all be happy to know, people who are slaving away to produce the Montgomery Advertiser, it looks a little podunk, and, fair game on that. A lot of papers do. At any rate, not exactly covering the national news, or even when Alabama is in it, I guess. Anyway, no problem. It makes no difference. AL.com seems to be, disguising the fact that Alabama is a news desert pretty well, and I think that was probably part of the reason for it. And you know how it is, the venture capital industry draining every dollar they can from newsrooms everywhere. It's a miracle there's a newspaper or news organization there at all. Okay, on to other things that I wanted to share with you. Let's see, before we get too esoteric, let me just take a look around. Oh yeah, there were definitely some other things that I wanted to share with you from the courtroom setting, and then we'll see whether we can segue out of that. But here's an interesting story that the New York Times ran just the other day, just in terms, when we tell you about these stories, or we read them so thoroughly, or just say, I can't just read the headline, I want to read you the body of the piece and comment on it along the way, especially the ones that give you the nitty-gritty details that somebody might otherwise skip over, whether Weisselberg's in jail already, or you say it violates the code, How so? And by the way, what is the code? And can we look it up and take a look at what does the thing actually say? Sometimes it pays. And of course, when Trump is involved, Trump and paperwork, man, you never know. But as it turns out, paperwork everywhere trips people up, and sometimes by design, and sometimes, unfortunately, the powers that be are a little bit oppressive about that and use the fact that paperwork is confusing and sometimes stupid and repetitive and has no particular reason behind it to screw you over. As, for instance, it does in Pennsylvania, where you might find that your mail-in ballot is invalidated and thrown out because you did not put the correct date on the outer envelope, not the ballot. And the date on the outer envelope, by everyone's admission, up and down the chain of command of the people who handle ballots and process them, we don't use that date for anything. There is no reason for it. We merely require it, essentially, to add an extra step to see if you're paying attention. And if you're not, we can assume that you're the kind of voter that we might want to exclude. Sometimes we'll maybe wave it through, but otherwise, if it turns out that you are, say, a Democratic voter, and we don't want that, we'll use that to get rid of this. So, anyway, I just thought it might be of interest to look at some more things. But it's not just your average voter that screws up paperwork or your average mortgagee. And, of course, we also learned quite a bit. We mentioned it just the other day from David Dayen about all sorts of people mess up the paperwork. Courts, officialdom, mortgage holders who pretend that they own the mortgage on houses that they have somehow repossessed even though they don't hold the note on it, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another example, I guess, of the weird things that can happen along the way with respect to getting your paperwork right, even among the people for whom paperwork is everything. This is some story. 16 crucial words that went missing from a landmark civil rights law. What? Intriguing. Subheader: the phrase, seemingly deleted in error, undermines the basis for everybody's favorite new concept. You'll have heard of it at some point. We haven't discussed it extensively on the show, but undermines the basis for qualified immunity, the legal shield that protects police officers from suits for misconduct. Very controversial concept. And wouldn't it be interesting to know that this was produced out of some sort of weird mistake of transcription somewhere? Well, it might be. Adam Liptak reported this for from Washington, because he's in the New York Times, but he's reporting from Washington. It's not a new story. It's an old-ish story. It's from May of 2023. And I don't remember exactly the provenance of how it was recirculated, but it must have had something to do with, well, I don't know. I'm not certain what it had to do with, but it's a welcome reminder, given that qualified immunity remains a real bugbear for a lot of people because it's ridiculous in its nature and is, in some cases, quite horrifically applied to deny any sort of remedy or recovery from people who are horribly mistreated or even killed by, police with no restraints, essentially. Or sometimes police with restraints, but still it doesn't matter. But qualified immunity is a big flashpoint in the law, and it turns out maybe it never should have been interpreted the way it's been interpreted. In a routine decision in March, and that would have been March of 2023, a unanimous 3-judge panel of a federal appeals court, that's the way they assemble panels, 3 judges, ruled against a Texas inmate, shocker, who was injured when the ceiling of the hog barn that he was working in collapsed. So they're not even alleging, police brutality here, but that sometimes happens, that qualified immunity interferes in cases like that. But here, he's working on some sort of prison farm, because Texas, and the ceiling of the hog barn collapses, and the family can't recover from the state, which is presumably responsible for the condition of this hog barn. The court, predictably, said the inmate could not overcome qualified immunity, the much criticized legal shield that protects government officials from suit for constitutional violations. The author of that decision, one Judge Don R. Willett, it's double L's and double T's, then did something unusual. This is unusual. He issued a separate concurring opinion to draw attention to the game-changing arguments in a recent law review article, one that seemed to demonstrate that the Supreme Court's entire qualified immunity jurisprudence was based on a mistake. Wait, what? Now, it's not me saying it. That's what Judge Willett wrote incredulously in his separate concurrence. That is interesting. He actually just used the old phrase, or the new, as the kids say. Wait, what? In 1871, not 1864, but not that long thereafter, 1871, after the Civil War, Congress enacted a law that allowed suits against state officials for violations of constitutional rights. But the Supreme Court, our modern Supreme Court, has said that the law, usually called Section 1983, familiar to any law students, but maybe not as so much for everybody else, but that's one of the most litigated sections, or the section most cited in litigation at any rate. Section 1983 did not, according to the Supreme Court, displace immunities for protecting officials that existed when the law was enacted. You see? So it doesn't overcome protections that were either written into law or, I guess, assumed as a matter of practice when the law was enacted. That would require, of course, the law to have some affirmative statement to the contrary, that it does, in fact, disregard laws then existing to the contrary. The doctrine of qualified immunity is based on that premise. Once again, 1871, Congress enacts the law allowing suits against state officials for violation of federal constitutional rights. The Supreme Court says Section 1983 does not displace immunities protecting officials that existed when the law was enacted. But the premise is wrong. No, the premise is wrong. This is a court drama. Alexander A. Reinhart, not to be confused with any other Alexander Reinhart, a professor at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, wrote in the article, Qualified Immunity's Flawed Foundation, published in the California Law Review. Between 1871, when the law was enacted, and 1874, when a government official produced the first compilation of federal laws, by the way, do you believe it took until 1874 to have the first compilation of federal laws put together? Professor Reinert wrote, 16 words of the original law went missing. I've skipped lines, paragraphs before, but come on. Those words, Professor Reinert wrote, showed that Congress had indeed overridden existing immunities. But exactly what the Supreme Court said they didn't do. Well, if they had meant that, they would have said it in the law. Well, suppose they said it in the law, but suppose that the guy copying down the law left it out. Is it part of the law or isn't it? Wow. Well, it is. But what if it hasn't been for 100 years and entire branches of Supreme Court jurisprudence are built on the quote-unquote fact that it doesn't say this thing? But it always did say this thing. Somebody pretended it didn't, and you copied that guy. Can you imagine? Well, you don't have to. It's actually happening. Judge Willett considered the implications of the finding. What if the Reconstruction Congress had explicitly stated right there in the original statutory text, I'm just a bill, only a bill, sitting here, Capitol Hill, got passed by both houses, made it through committee, both houses, sent to the White House, the president has signed. You remember how off to the White House for the president to sign, and the whole thing happens, and it gets signed and everything, and then they write it down and they just leave this other part out. Is that just a bill, only a bill? What happens? What if the Reconstruction Congress had explicitly stated right there in the original statutory text that it was nullifying all common law defenses against Section 1983 actions? That would be great, but they didn't. But they did. Judge Willett, that's Judge Willett's question to the court. That is, what if Congress's literal language unequivocally negated the original interpretive premise for qualified immunity? Well, holy crap, that would really be something, wouldn't it? Well, the original version of the law, the one that was enacted in 1871, said state officials who subject, quote, any person within the jurisdiction of the United States to the deprivation of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured by the Constitution of the United States shall, any such law, statute, ordinance, regulation, custom, or usage of the state to the contrary, notwithstanding, I know that's a lot of verbiage, but you get it, shall be liable to the party injured in any action at law, suit in equity, or other proper proceeding for redress. The words in italics, and the ones I tried to emphasize there, any such law, statute, ordinance, regulation, custom, or usage of the state to the contrary, notwithstanding, those words, for reasons lost to history, were omitted from the first compilation of federal laws in 1874, which was prepared by a government official called the Reviser of the Federal Statutes. I mean, who cares what the guy was called, but there it is. And I mean, you know, since 1874, people have been relying on this as the authoritative copy. And I mean, I guess you're entitled to that assumption usually, right? And 99 times out of 100, 999 times out of 1,000, presumably, if you go back and double check, right? Who does that? Does anybody? I could do that, right? You know, it says here that I don't know, read you the Second Amendment. Are you sure that it says that? Does it really say that? Does it really say well-regulated militia? Because honestly, these militias are not particularly well-regulated. It must not say that, or whatever it is, you know, or I want to reinterpret the First Amendment. Go back and just double check. Does the First Amendment in my copy, my pocket copy of the Constitution, and the one that's online, match exactly word for word with the document that was issued from the Philadelphia Convention? Well, probably. But, you know, well, what about this? What about this statute? What about this statute? Are you going to spend all that time doing that? And then, of course, you go back and you check. Well, I'll look in the compilation of federal statutes from 1874. Yeah, this matches pretty close. It's exactly what the Supreme Court says it is. All right, but I want you to check. Did anything happen between the original law as passed in 1871 and the way it was copied down in 1874? Who would think to look? I'm sure it was an accident that they found it. But can this happen? No, it's absurd, right? Well, I have news for you. Except it's not news. We knew it a year ago. Anyway, we didn't know it in 1874, which was the critical moment. So there you have it. The reviser's error, whether one of omission or commission, we don't know, has never been corrected, Judge Willett wrote. The logic of the Supreme Court's qualified immunity jurisprudence, why is this important? The logic of qualified immunity is that Congress would not have displaced existing immunities without saying so, right? You can't just assume, oh, what Congress really meant was that we have this new Section 1983, and by the way, all state laws that say the opposite or say that there's any kind of immunity that Section 1983 would purport to get rid of, we're not getting rid of those things. But from now on, you can't do that. Or whatever, maybe, was the interpretation. At the very least, the interpretation was, well, you're not going to just invalidate every state law or custom or whatever usage you want based on nothing. well, obviously Congress meant to supplant that. Well, they know how to supplant that. If they wanted to supplant that, they could have said so, but they didn't. But they did. That's the amazing thing. The omitted language confirms that the Reconstruction Congress in 1871 intended to provide a broad remedy for civil rights violations by state officials. Professor Reinhardt said in an interview, noting that the law was enacted soon after the 3 constitutional amendments ratified after the Civil War to outlaw slavery, insist on equal protection, and guard the right to vote, 13th, 14th, 15th amendments. Along with other contemporaneous evidence, including legislative history, it helps to show that Congress meant to fully enforce the Reconstruction Amendments via a powerful new cause of action, Professor Reinhardt said. Interesting, too. I wonder if there's anything, since the Supreme Court just recently said, well, the 14th Amendment's Section 3 isn't self-enforcing, and you can't use it to exclude Trump from the ballot because reasons. If they really meant for it to be enforceable, they would have enforced it with some legislation. Well, look, now you have to sit there and say, how do I know they didn't enforce it with legislation and it just got, oopsie, left out by the reviser of the federal statutes or whatever they call the guy. It's happened before. Sounds crazy, but it did happen. Maybe someone needs to take a look. I don't know. In all likelihood, it won't bear any fruit, but I guess you got to ask that question now. This is just kind of, I don't know, amazing. And it's not Trump's paperwork, but maybe the guy who did it was kind of Trumpy before Trump ever existed, or I don't know. Maybe he was for his great-great-great-great-grandfather or something like that. I don't know. But there you have it. Along with other contemporaneous evidence, including legislative history, and you know how much the conservatives, including Scalia, they used to just snort and scorn legislative history whenever it was against them. Occasionally they would use it to their own advantage, but they used to hate that. I don't care what the legislative history. I care about what the law actually says. The black letter committed to paper. Don't tell me about what happened in committee. Don't tell me about what happened during the debates declaring their intention. They didn't include this in the strict, in the 4 corners of the document. I don't care about it. What if they did include it in the 4 corners and somebody else left it out? And then the Supreme Court interpreted its being missing as the actual intent of Congress. Wouldn't that be something? So, yeah, legislative history sometimes includes, well, what about the actual legislation itself and what it actually said? Because that apparently now has to be included in legislative history, because part of the history was part of this stupid bill got erased for no reason. Judge Willett, who was, by the way, appointed by President Donald J. Trump, focused on the words of the original statute in this text-centric judicial era when jurists profess unswerving fidelity to the words Congress chose. That's his quote. Qualified immunity, which requires plaintiffs to show that the officials had violated a constitutional right that was clearly established in a previous ruling, has been widely criticized by scholars and judges across the ideological spectrum. Justice Clarence Thomas, for instance, wrote that it does not appear to resemble the immunities available in 1871. Professor Reinhardt's article said that is only half the story. Holy mackerel. What's the rest of the story? Everybody who wrote it was a pedophile? That's what happened in the Arizona case. Anyway, the real problem, he wrote, is that no qualified immunity doctrine at all should apply in Section 1983 actions if courts stay true to the text adopted by the enacting Congress, as opposed to the mistaken 1874 version. Joanna Schwartz, a law professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, you know it as, and the author of a book entitled Shielded: How the Police Became Untouchable, said that there is general agreement that the qualified immunity doctrine, as it currently operates, looks nothing like any protections that may have existed in 1871. So even if that part of the law was missing, or was never written into it. There weren't any state laws at the time that said, yeah, sure, they're just cops and the state can do pretty much anything that they want. So there's not even any historical basis for that. The new article, she said, identified additional causes for skepticism, to say the least. It's the original cause for skepticism. Holy cow. She added that Judge Willett's concurring opinion has brought much needed and well-deserved attention to Alex Reinhardt's insightful article. Honestly, Alex Reinhardt ought to be, a household name. Discovering this is incredible. I wonder where he figured it out. That's the guy we need to talk to. Judge Willett wrote that he and his colleagues are middle management circuit judges who cannot overrule Supreme Court decisions. Only that court, he wrote, can definitively grapple with Section 1983's enacted text and decide whether it means what it says. And or actually has to decide what it says in the first place. That's amazing. Lawyers for the injured Texas inmate, Kevion Rogers, said they were weighing their options. I should hope so. The scholarship that Judge Willett unearthed in his concurrence is undoubtedly important to the arguments that civil rights litigants can make in the future. The lawyers, Matthew J. Kita and Damon Mathias, said in a statement. Normally, they added, you cannot raise a new argument for reversal for the first time on appeal, much less at the Supreme Court of the United States. But one would think that if the Supreme Court acknowledges that it has been reciting and applying the statute incorrectly for nearly a century, there must be some remedy available to litigants whose judgments are not yet final, to say the least. But yeah, you see the dynamics that Judge Willett is talking about here. He's like, okay, I've discovered an article that seems to say that this portion of the law is just missing for no reason and it belongs in there. And obviously, if it's in there, all of the premise of the qualified immunity jurisprudence is wrong on its face, just totally upside down and backwards. But I am who I am. I am just a circuit court judge. And while the circuit court is, an appellate court and it's higher in the hierarchy than the federal trial courts, they're all still subject to the Supreme Court. That's still the way we have decided it works in this country. The Supreme Court gets to state definitively what the law is, even when the law, has been transcribed incorrectly. So he's saying it's pretty obvious, but the way we work in this country, a circuit court can't declare the Supreme Court wrong and overrule it. It can simply suggest, by way of this sort of separate concurrence, that, hey, maybe the next time there's a qualified immunity case, the Supreme Court and the litigants there should make mention of this and give the Supreme Court, which has the actual authority to overrule this stuff and throw out previous Supreme Court precedent, maybe they want to go ahead and do that or find some way to approach doing that next time they have a qualified immunity case. And in the meantime, everybody just has to live with it. And if you've had your case adjudicated and gone to the Supreme Court and been told, no, qualified immunity, get out, you're just going to have to live with it, maybe forever, but at the very least until the Supreme Court says in the next qualified immunity case, yeah, we forgot about these 16 words, and yeah, that's going to have an impact. Now, we're just ruling in this case, but I guess we have to open the door for previous qualified immunity litigants to go back, probably back to the district court and say, given that, I'd like to start whatever process is available to me to start getting a remedy. It's complicated, but it's one of those things that you'd think, well, that just doesn't happen, right? Well, sometimes it does. And it happens in all sorts of contexts. And sometimes when you're talking about how the Senate rules work with somebody who's actually a senator and maybe even has been for a long time, or a member of the House about House rules, and they just say, that's just not the way it works. And you point out to them that, well, actually, maybe it is, or at least it certainly could be. Or maybe in the case of the use of what became known as the nuclear option, well, that's just not the way it works. Well, actually, that's the way you leveraged that to change the rules in 1975, and actually a couple of you were there to do that. Oh, well, Yeah, either we forgot about that or wished we had forgotten about that. Sometimes they really just don't know. It's really kind of bizarre. But what a story. Okay, that ate up that segment. And but I don't know. It's been waiting in the wings, but it really kind of absolutely had to be discussed. All right. By the way, I see that there's some new Pocket update that I definitely disapprove of. And when you click on some of these things that are in Pocket, it used to open your story in a new window. Now it just switches your Pocket window to that story. No good. Anyway, doesn't matter. We'll be right back for one more segment after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And our last segment before exiting for Friday, I can already see that we're going to end up with a pile-up at the end. I do want to put on the record that Amanda Marcotte, who I love to go back to, especially for things like this, has taken up a subject that I just saw originally covered one of the other papers that we were reading, one of the big papers of record, either the Washington Post or perhaps the New York Times, had picked up on it, and I saw it as one of the sidebar stories from a couple of days ago about this. But just to put on record, and then Amanda picked it up for later treatment, a story about, I guess, for us, a new entrant, or at least on the show, a new entrant in the weird man-fluencer, Andrew Tate, toxic male category. Now that he's got, I guess, legal troubles making it perhaps more difficult for him to spread his misogyny, there's now room for what counts as a new entrant for us here. And maybe not for you. Maybe you've witnessed this guy. I think I've seen his posts in the past on social media. And he's a guy who it's sometimes difficult. And apparently this is his shtick. And that's what Amanda is investigating. That you can't tell whether you're looking at a parody account or a sincere attempt at being an influencer of young men to introduce them to like misogyny as a lifestyle. And what's his name? Nick Adams, who's always billed himself. I mean, it's like, it looks like a parody account. Has sort of always billed himself as like Nick Adams, alpha male, as a username, like on Twitter. And it's impossibly clownish misogyny, except apparently that's the shtick. So I recommend to you, without reading it on the air, Amanda Marcotte's latest on this subject. And in fact, it begins, the title of the piece is, I should have clicked it into a new window. I guess not every publication works this way on Pocket, but some of them do. Latest masculinity influencer. That's, I guess, the term they're using for it. Another dude bro guiding followers into deeper loneliness. Self-described alpha male, quote unquote, alpha male. Nick Adams is offering young men, quote, advice that will only alienate them even further. And in skimming it, it's interesting. You should keep up. We should have this guy's name on the radar. I guess he's going to make trouble for himself and others and has been for some time. And, she does point out here, just in the opening, let's say at the opening couple of paragraphs, that'll give you a sense of what this guy is about. Now that Andrew Tate may be facing a mounting number of international charges for alleged sex crimes, but this doesn't mean that we've seen the end of masculinity influencers who make big bucks by preying on the insecurities of young men. On Tuesday, Ben Terrace of the Washington Post profiled, that's where it comes from, I guess, Nick Adams, a self-described alpha male. I mean, the term is toxic. Anyway, who wins over young men with an "is he kidding" shtick, focused on the ever-present threat of emasculation, supposedly posed by everything from liberals to girlfriends to salmon entrees at restaurants. You get the idea? Only, what kind of a beta cook eats salmon when you could be killing and eating a giraffe right in front of everybody, raw? You know, you get the idea. Like most similar marketers of so-called masculinity, Adams targets young men's fears of loneliness or failure, which are no doubt both real and prevalent, with the false premise that embracing aggressive misogyny is the key to achieving your dreams. Adams has evidently cashed in because he's good at employing faux irony in order to push his message. Terrace, who has an eye for telling details, and I can't tell whether that's for I think that's an eye for telling details. That is, the details about Nick Adams that are telling about what he's really doing, zeroes in on excellent examples of the jokey but serious rhetoric. And that's enclosed in quotes. They're jokey but serious. In one of his swears they're true stories, for instance, Adams describes lecturing a date. "You are the supporting cast. I am the main character. I am a king, and I expect to be treated like it." And I guess that's supposedly, maybe he tried it and it worked on one person, so he tells everybody you got to do it. Maybe it never happened because it's ridiculous and you would think you would just get whatever is on the table thrown in your face, but not everybody's like that. I don't know. But that's what he's supposedly selling the kids these days. In a story praising the value of screaming at women. Like this is dating advice. You should scream at your dates. "I exploded on her, issuing a correction that rattled her to her core. After that, her apology was, shall we say, more enthusiastic." He advises not allowing female partners any say in how to decorate her own home, for instance, except maybe permitting, quote, a small area for her to do her scrapbooking or to host her sewing machine. Much like someone giving their dog a doghouse, I thought, Amanda says. Well, you should take a look, both at Ben Terrace's article and hers. Just wanted to put this wackadoodle's name on the radar because, I don't know, he will become or will inspire a mass shooter at one point when some of his advice, quote-unquote advice, doesn't work. All right. Anyway, so that's on record. Just wanted to put that there. By the way, I also happened to see in Pocket the provenance of, for me, the New York Times article that I just read you about the missing words from Section 1983's landmark civil rights law. Joshua Ehrlich, who has got a Blue Sky account, describes himself as a civil rights lawyer, exhausted, is the account that put this fascinating article in front of me. So credit for that to Joshua Ehrlich if it somehow gets to him. Anyway, yes, it's pretty incredible. And what else do we want to share with you? Oh, okay. So I have I had just been scrolling down to find it, but then I passed by the Amanda Marcotte thing. It's important that I think everybody ought to have him on the radar. There's a couple of other things here that I was thinking I ought to share with you. One was I guess, harken back to one of our other procedural stories, the upcoming attempt, I guess, by the House Republicans to hold Merrick Garland, Attorney General, in contempt of Congress for not complying with their subpoenas. Some response from the Justice Department along traditional lines, reminding us how these things used to be handled in the past. I thought I might add it to the record here. It's from the Hill, Rebecca Beach having provided the byline here. Justice Department asks GOP to, quote, avoid conflict following Garland contempt threat. Well, they live and breathe. That's their oxygen. So I don't know that they're going to avoid conflict, but that's the traditional approach to these things, by the way. One part that I hadn't reiterated in the history of contempt of Congress procedure, while I explained to everybody, one, the existence of the inherent contempt procedure, and two, its necessity to underscore the power of the statutory approach. Why should there even be a statutory approach? And the answer is, don't make us do it ourselves. It's a lot more orderly, and people understand and recognize the courtroom proceeding a lot better than us doing it ourselves, I think was the thinking. But in addition to that, one of the problems that arose in the early years, early 2000s, is that what we call them? When there was a conflict between the then off and on again democratically controlled House of Representatives, anyway, attempting to subpoena George W. Bush administration officials and running into that problem. I subpoena this or that information from you. You refuse to comply. I hold you in contempt of Congress. We refer the contempt of Congress charges to the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., but that's a DOJ official and therefore a executive branch official, and unitary executive theory being what it is, the president, strongly encourages the Attorney General, who is, after all, sort of kind of independent, to not pursue the charges of contempt of Congress against their fellow member of the executive branch. That circuitous reasoning becomes tighter when it's the Attorney General being charged with contempt of Congress. Of course, the U.S. Attorney does, in fact, report to the DOJ and to the Attorney General. And whether or not the president suggests it, it's less than likely, normally, for an Attorney General to say, yes, absolutely, launch a prosecution of me. But this is Merrick Garland. He might think that's really super fair to do. Gil, by the way, reminds me that they sometimes refer to those early 2000s as the noughts, the archaic usage, but that occasionally, I guess the British and tabloids sometimes love to refer to them as the naughties. But anyway, I don't know if that's going to catch on, but naughty is kind of funny. At any rate, here's what the Justice Department has to say about how they think the Republicans in Congress ought to be pursuing these or addressing this issue. And by the way, not only do they urge caution, but the courts traditionally anyway, maybe not anymore, have also urged that caution. What will often happen is a referral for contempt of Congress will get litigated in some way. And when the courts then get it and Congress is saying, oh, we want you to enforce this subpoena, the judges often say, this is an interbranch conflict. This is the legislative branch telling the executive branch that they have to comply with their wishes, and they're looking to us, the judicial branch, to enforce it. And really, this is an issue where, hey, we're all supposed to be, equally powerful. We're all the separation of powers, but keeps our powers separate, but also balances them one against the other. And sometimes there's no clear way to determine who the winner should be. And after all, we can use our power to declare this a political question and refuse to settle it. But we can also admonish you to find a damn settlement, because honestly, no one knows how we are going to settle this question of what happens in a collision between an immovable object and an irresistible force. That's the way I've always kind of put it there. And the judges have often said, well, we don't want to and we can't, so you have to figure out a solution yourself. And in every other instance prior to about 2010, they have, in fact, come to some sort of solution. Well, the courts aren't going to enforce this, but it's in everybody's interest for us to just come to some. How about you give us slightly less of the material we're demanding from you? But what if you are now dealing with absolutists, as you are with the Freedom Caucus MAGA wing of the House Republican Conference? Well, step one, the Justice Department urged House Republicans to avoid conflict in a brewing battle after they threatened the possibility of contempt proceedings in their efforts to gain information on Special Counsel Robert Hur's probe of President Biden's handling of classified documents. The Monday letter, and this piece was dated April 8th, so we're back a week or two when we're talking about which Monday. It wasn't this Monday, it was the Monday previous. The Monday letter from the Justice Department's head of legislative affairs asserts the House's Oversight and Judiciary Committees, both, received the information that they requested when they asked for transcript of Hur's interview with Biden, as well as a recording of the conversation. They likewise asked for some of the classified documents, as well as all communications with Biden's attorneys. Now, it's the Justice Department's position that they have actually complied with the subpoena, but it's the committee's position that if they stamp their feet and scream and say that they didn't, that they can bring statutory contempt of Congress proceedings against Garland. The committees have received the information you requested. That information may not have substantiated the concerns the committees articulated, but it does appear to help resolve them and your inquiry. Assistant Attorney General Carlos Uriarte, I'm guessing at that pronunciation, wrote to House Oversight and Accountability Chair James Comer and House Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan, basically saying, you demanded these documents, we gave you the documents. You said, well, where's the proof that Biden is involved in an international vampire cabal? And the answer is, there isn't any. Well, then you haven't complied with our subpoena. Yeah, we have. You've asked us for all of the documents we have pertaining to X. This is it. And guess what? There's no document about the vampire cabal. I'm sorry. It just doesn't exist. Now, we gave you all of the things you requested. It might be that these concerns you have aren't actually substantiated by the evidence you wanted from us, but you do have the evidence. The letter goes on to assert that the chairs may have requested the information for political purposes that should have no role in determining which law enforcement files are shared. The two chairs have sought to connect Hur's inquiry to their own impeachment investigation into Biden, a struggling effort that has faced further challenges since the arrest of an FBI informant who accused Biden of taking a bribe as vice president in connection with his son's work in Ukraine. The informant was accused of fabricating that claim and indicted on charges of making false statements to the Bureau. We are, therefore, concerned that the committees are disappointed not because you didn't receive information, but because you did. And the information just doesn't say what you wanted. We urge the committees to avoid conflict rather than to seek it, Uriarte wrote. The GOP impeachment leaders nonetheless suggested Biden may have sought to place limitations during his interview on that subject, likewise asking for 2 documents related to Ukraine. including a call in which he exchanged pleasantries with the country's former prime minister. That deserves dramatic music for sure. Uriarte said the committees have responded with escalation and threats of criminal contempt, despite productions on each of the 4 subpoena items having met or exceeded the committee's stated informational needs. While the Justice Department has shared the transcript of Biden's interview with her, it did not turn over the prized audio recordings Republicans demanded. The Biden administration does not get to determine what Congress needs and does not need for its oversight of the executive branch. It's curious the Biden administration is refusing to release the audio of President Biden's interview with special counsel after releasing the transcript, Comer said in a statement. And it is a little bit, I guess. But I'm sure Justice is saying, well, we gave you the transcript. What more do you need? Well, these days, I guess, to be fair, it does pay to compare the actual audio recording to the transcript for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is, hey, why isn't this part in the transcript? Maybe it's actually relevant. I don't know if that happened, but if it happened to the laws in 1874, I guess it could happen here too. Why shouldn't the American people be able to hear the actual audio? I mean, it's a lot of table pounding, but there is some kernel of a point in there somewhere. Well, why not give us the audio? But of course, they're going to grandstand. Why shouldn't the American people be able to hear the actual audio of his answers? The American people demand transparency from their leaders, not obstruction. The Oversight Committee will continue to work with the Judiciary Committee to obtain the information needed for our investigation of President Biden's willful retention, which apparently was not the case in her mind, of classified documents. We will respond to the Justice Department soon. The letter came after the 2 chairs threatened contempt proceedings against Attorney General Merrick Garland. The back and forth over the recordings suggest that the 2 sides could be headed towards a legal battle over the matter, something that could spur Biden to assert executive privilege and bar its release. Biden did not do so with any other aspect of Her's report, which, while offering a critical assessment of his memory, determined that there was no evidence that the president willfully retained any national security documents from his time as vice president. The committees have had the transcripts since March 12th, the same day Her testified before the House Judiciary Committee. In many ways, the transcript was helpful for Biden, showing more nuance to portions of the conversation that led Her to criticize the president's mental acuity and memory. The department is concerned that the committee's particular focus on continuing to demand information that is cumulative of information we already gave you, what the president and Mr. Her's team said in the interview, indicates that the committee's interest may not be in receiving information in service of legitimate oversight or investigatory functions, but rather to serve political purposes that should have no role in the treatment of law enforcement files, Uriarte wrote. Right? In other words, they're starting to imagine, if you have the transcript, why do you want the audio? And if the answer is, well, we can, illegally, make radio ads for Republican candidates if we can find a snippet of audio to use, well, that's not a legitimate function of legislative process, is it? No. Well, I swear we're totally not going to do that. Okay, well, but we think you might actually. But we're not gonna, maybe, sort of. I mean, that's, I think, what part of this conflict is about. The Justice Department argued that the GOP investigators would be hard-pressed to make a case that they had a need for the audio files, given that they have the transcripts on hand, saying they would struggle to show the legislative purpose behind the request, often needed to go back to back such requests when challenged in court. In other words, we demand the audio. Okay, why? Because we want to legislate something that will prevent this from ever happening again. Okay, but in what sense does the audio help you do that the transcript does not? Yeah. The American people demand it. Okay, but that's not a thing. Except, of course, if you draw a Trump judge. in which case maybe it is a thing. If the GOP panels followed through on their threats to hold Garland in contempt of Congress, it would largely be an empty gesture, is the way they summarize it here. Such matters serve as a referral to the Justice Department, which then evaluates whether there is sufficient evidence to bring such a case. True in the first instance, but now you find yourself having to ask, in light of all the things that we've discussed about contempt of Congress in the past, and stories about, like the one we just read, sometimes, statutes don't say what they think you say. Experts don't know what you think they know. Does Rebecca Beach know about inherent contempt? I don't want to tip off the Republicans in Congress who would, it would be a really interesting test. But I would think they would understand, well, maybe not. They might actually try to do something. But what's really interesting about this is, in years gone by, in years past, when Democrats controlled, let's say, the House of Representatives and attempted to do something like this and then found only frustration, it was, what did they say? Rebecca puts it here at the bottom. It would be a largely empty gesture because the Justice Department handles these things. When the shoe was on the other foot, and we started to point out, by the way, but some of this frustration is poorly founded, or some of the objections from the administration are poorly founded, and they simply will opt not to prosecute. For whatever reason, we didn't believe the approach that the Bush administration was taking was legitimate, but we somehow find sympathy for it in the Biden administration. Well-founded? I don't know. Arguments to be made, certainly. But when we found that they were going to face only this frustration, we reminded them that there is the inherent contempt procedure. And we were astonished to find, one, that they claimed not to know that there was such a procedure. And then, of course, two, when there was such a procedure, it was explained to them, they said, well, it would be political suicide. And everybody, the Washington consensus was, it would be absolute political suicide for the esteemed members of Congress to attempt to throw members of the administration, much less the president or vice president or any cabinet member, into the no longer existing Capitol prison until they coughed up the documents. That would be insane. The American people would never stand for it. Now, will the same logic apply to members of Congress who are Republicans and who might, in their insanity, decide to pursue something along the lines of inherent contempt if they were to find out about it? It would make for an interesting test to see whether the Washington establishment still believed that it was political suicide to do so. And then, of course, they could, in fact, believe that, and they could be totally wrong about it being political suicide. Or they may just change their minds about what constitutes political suicide when Republicans are the ones who might otherwise be committing it. So, okay, that is of interest and something to keep an eye on. There are a million other things, of course, not all of which, or maybe I would say at this point in the game, none of which would actually fit in today's show because we're coming up to the end. But let me throw out something else that's weird and developing and we ought to keep an eye on. I have seen something about it, and it involves Kristi Noem, who's always weird. And by the way, did we mention the other day that she seems to have been having herself remade in the image of the Trump family women at some point? I can't remember whether that was just a private comment, perhaps on social media, or whether we actually made some mention of it on the air, but it's actually getting some press attention. But not this. This isn't what it's about. Maybe I can throw you that story for your own consumption over the weekend. From the South Dakota Searchlight.com comes this. Oh, good. Quick read. Third tribal nation bans Governor Kristi Noem from reservation. Mackenzie Huber reports for us just the other day. We missed the first two, but it does ring a bell for me. I think I saw it happening, and I wasn't 100% clear on why. Now that there's three of them, something's happening we should know about. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe headquartered in North Dakota, but with reservation borders expanding into South Dakota, is the third tribal nation to ban Governor Kristi Noem from tribal lands this year. What's interesting is that, what their reasoning is. That is interesting, but we don't have time to get to that. But I think it has to do perhaps with work to block pipelines that she, as a conservative Republican, would naturally be in favor of. But in addition to this, she is retaliating in a way against the tribes that are banning her from their lands by claiming that the bans actually have something to do with preventing her from uncovering their widespread and obvious collaboration with Mexican drug cartels, which is sort of at the other end of the continent there. But at any rate, she's suggesting that their banning her really has to do with the fact that she's somehow about to blow the lid off of this major story or something, which sounds like a pretty stupid fabrication, but, there's lots of that going around. That's what the Searchlight has to say about it. The Wednesday announcement comes after the Standing Rock Sioux Tribal Council voted to banish Noem for racially charged comments that she made last month at 2 town halls, alleging some tribal leaders are, quote, personally benefiting from Mexican drug cartel activity on reservations. The governor's wild and irresponsible attempt to connect tribal leaders and parents with Mexican drug cartels is a sad reflection of her fear-based politics that do nothing to bring people together to solve problems. That was tribal chairwoman Janet Alkire, or maybe Alkire, Alkire, in a news release. Rather than make uninformed and unsubstantiated claims, Noem should work with tribal leaders to increase funding and resources for tribal law enforcement and education. Well, that's never going to happen, obviously. 5 tribes have demanded an apology from Noem since then. She has not issued an apology, but she has issued press releases calling on tribes to, quote, banish the cartels. One wonders what might be at the bottom of this one. But I just want to kind of put that one on the radar, too. Kristi Noem now vying for the vice presidential nomination. You should keep an eye on that and other weird developments around her behavior.
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, as previously mentioned, some technical glitches will keep the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy from the air today, but they will have a news roundup available, so they are still streaming, obviously, I think, if you've been listening to this show, and they will have some programming for you. It was just local production that was affected. We'll see you next week.